Charles Massy is a regenerative farmer, author and speaker with a growing national and global reputation. Interestingly, Tim Flannery recently said that the reality behind his work is as much revealed through Google Earth. If you search for the properties mentioned in Charles' book, and there are some people in this room that fall into that category, you will find oases of green surrounded by that parched devastation we've come to think of as the normal state of Australian agricultural lands. That groundbreaking book, evocatively titled Call of the Reed Warbler, is an incredibly comprehensive account of how a grassroots revolution can regenerate country, help turn climate change around, and build healthy people and healthy communities. What's as moving about Charles' story as his work is his personal experience, from declaring himself to be an unknowing, chemical-using farmer with dead soils. Charles has become a radical ecologist farmer, carefully regenerating a 2,000 hectare property to a state of natural health. He's been awarded an Order of Australia medal, but has more recently been called an unlikely leader of the underground agricultural insurgency taking place in farms across Australia. I've had people from RCS to the RegenWA team say that Call of the Reed Warbler has really changed things in the last 18 months in particular. The Aussie publisher at UQP also said, "We've had so much interest in this book, it's clearly the right message at the right time." And that was before the aforementioned Paul Hawken endorsed what became the international edition as a definitive masterpiece that takes its place along with the writings of Aldo Leopold, Wendell Berry and Michael Pollan. Charles' research and the many visits to Western Australian farms puts him in a great position today to describe what Regen Ag is, why we need it, and what it means globally and for WA farmers and our farming landscape. Please give him a warm hand.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and to RegenWA for this opportunity. Minister McTiernan and any Whadjuk Noongar and other nations people here, and ladies and gentlemen. I will touch on the John the Baptist comment, because anyone who's read their scriptures knows what's happened to John the Baptist. But I would say there are thousands of John the Baptists going around Australian and international landscapes, and some of those leading thinkers are in this room today, and my book was really a collation of their stories. And I think it's appropriate that we have this conference in Western Australia. As I said, there's many of the leading innovators come from this state, and it's a state that's always been entrepreneurial in its approach to farming and business. And really importantly, there are both local and regional food systems now developing, and regenerative agriculture will be nothing unless that's integrally linked and goes forward. And of course, it's had a long Indigenous culture, over 60 millennia of caring for the land and regenerating it. And uniquely, in my experience, it's got a minister that sees the vision and is prepared to have the courage to push it. So that's the good news. What I'd like to do now is skate quickly across a broad terrain to give you a background that will hopefully set up the conference. So it is a simple message. If we have healthy landscapes and soils, as has been mentioned, from that comes healthy food, and let's not forget fibre, and healthy profits, people on a healthy planet. There's plenty of definitions. One I like, because it comes from an understanding of complex adaptive systems, is that regenerative agriculture comprises agricultural practices that enable landscapes and systems to self-organise back to open-ended health, to self-heal. I mean, we're talking about systems with millions of years of coevolution, which have what are called emergent properties within them. We've stumped on them. Regenerative agriculture is taking off the handcuffs and allowing those to redevelop. So the big context, and we'll be discussing climate later. You can see those rats are discovering they're not in a good position. But this whole discussion now has to be within, I believe, the context of the looming Anthropocene, the fact that our planet has now moved into a whole new epoch. So there it is, that blue-green planet. There's only one that we know of in the whole solar system and further, and extraordinarily, it's blue-green because of life, and it's there because life itself has created conditions for life. And now one of those species of that life is radically destabilising what's been a unique 12,000 years of the Holocene that was ideal for the evolution of agriculture and human civilisation. Why we've moved into the Anthropocene is what's called the Great Acceleration post the 1950s and 1960s. You probably can't see the detail there, but if you look at the orange trends, socio-economic, rising population, rising GDP, rising investment, etc., they've all gone up exponentially post the 1950s and 60s. And the same applies to the Earth system trends, whether it's all the greenhouse gases, the methanes, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, our use of water, degradation of biodiversity, etc., all showing that exponential rising trend. And the other one that correlates with that is the modern health diseases. Probably 2-decade delay behind the other accelerating factors, but if you look at all the modern enormous exponential increase, the ADHDs, the autism, the cancers, etc., the same pattern, and those red lines there, someone superimposed the rapid use of glyphosate post 1980s, etc. Now, I'm not saying that's a one-on-one cause, but it's an interesting correlation to how we were interfering in a major way with what was a previous safe operating landscape functions. This just illustrates what a powerful species we are. The Aral Sea was once the 4th largest freshwater body in the world, almost exactly the same size as Tasmania. Soviet-era cotton production, and that might be a lesson for us to think about with our Murray-Darling Basin. It drained that lake. We are very powerful when we set our minds to it. So in short, we are overloading our natural systems. And I'm not going to get into the Anthropocene, but it's not just about climate. That's become the bogey. It's one of 9 integrated Earth systems, all working together to sustain, within a thin, fragile ozone layer and atmosphere, the ideal conditions for life. And we've now destabilised all those 9 integrated systems. Climate's an obvious one. We're now in the 6th greatest extinction event on Earth, the biodiversity side, this time caused by humans. And then there's land system change, freshwater use, etc. If you look at the evidence, what's disturbing is that industrial agriculture appears and is either a major player or a key factor in causing damage to 6 of those key biophysical Earth systems. We can't dodge that. But I see that as grounds for hope. Because as we've already heard this morning, there are other ways of going about it. And if industrial agriculture is proving a major causal factor, then a different sort of agriculture that regenerates landscape functions can help turn that around. And I'll show that later. We can do that dramatically. So how do we get into this mess? And I've deliberately put a hyphen between agri and culture, because it's one farmer said, it's this square foot of real estate here that's the problem. When I was young and silly, I used to do a fair bit of climbing, and this was on a trip to the Indian Himalayas. And I photographed this guy up in the steep hill country. Now, on his shoulder is almost an exact replica of the first plough from 8,000 years ago. Bearing in mind we domesticated animals and crops probably about 10,000 years ago. To me, that's a metaphor, because we've been destabilising and exposing healthy soil, either through grazing or bad cropping practices ever since. Now, our Western agriculture evolved in that area in the Middle East called the Fertile Crescent, Syria, Iran, Libya, etc. Beautiful, diverse, spongy grasslands where the first plants, little weedy cereals were developed. Our modern cereals were domesticated. So were sheep and goats about 10,000 years ago. Most of the Mediterranean was forested. Let's have a look where we are today. The Fertile Crescent Syria, Iran, Libya, Iraq, all the way around the top of South Africa, the Sahel. It's all desert. Constant drought, constant social conflict. That's 9,000 years of our Western agriculture. And as Roosevelt said at the height of the Great Dust Bowl of America, a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. If you look at, have a look at our 9,000 year history of agriculture, of over 13 billion hectares suitable for agriculture worldwide, we humans have now degraded nearly 40% of that. We are a powerful species. Look at the last couple of months. That heat wave that hit Europe, Amazonia ablaze, as well as the Siberian forests. A couple of weeks ago, just in one day in Greenland, 12 billion tonnes of ice melted in one day. If you look at that top left photo, that heat wave that hit Europe, where did it come from? It came from that degraded land on North Africa and the Sahel. And we're pretty good, and I can speak with authority because I've done it, at degrading our soils here, whether through exposing them, taking off the cover, destroying the soil biology, poisoning it, or overgrazing it. So I guess what I'm arguing is we've got to phase out this 10,000 year tradition, that metaphor of that disturbing implement, and move to something that doesn't destroy but nurtures and regenerates. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but how did this happen? Well, it was following the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, and capitalist revolution. We moved from, if you like, that indigenous mind, an organic mind that saw ourselves as indivisible to Mother Earth. What you did to the mother, you did to yourselves. And by the time those ideas came to Australia, 19th century on, the earth is just a substrate from which we extract profits. That's a huge shift in mind. And so what happened was that mind came out of northwestern Europe, humid atmosphere, rich soils, post-glacial, very young soils compared to our up to 3.8 billion year old soils. And the implements and practices that came from that. I was at a conference the other day in England, and I heard Alan Savory. He pretty much insulted the English audience. He said, you guys couldn't cause a desert if you tried to. Your country is that non-brittle. It is that wet and soft and rich. And pretty much a comment. Our landscapes right across Australia are quite different to where those ideas and implements have come from. And that's just a photo of the Mallee drought of the 30s. We don't talk about our dust bowls. We've had a few of them. That red arrow at the top is the amount of soil it started with. And as Wes Jackson says, he's a great thinker in this sphere, the ploughshare may well have destroyed more options for future generations than the sword. That's nearly 40% of available agricultural land now degraded. Is it just the past? No. On the left, that's a dust storm hitting Mildura a few months ago. And on the right, on Friday, I drove for 2 hours through northern New South Wales, the black soil. It was constant dust storm, and that's a dust storm hitting Armidale only 4 days ago. So are we in denial about the fact we're still desertifying with our practices? I think components are, but I think why this conference is so fully attended, we know there's another pathway. It's accelerating, and we're at a really exciting moment. And the key is biologically healthy, rich soils and the systems that go with it, water cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I now want to talk about. Got rid of the bad news. So in summary, it's plants with grazing animals. It was emphasised earlier, we need to look at animals within our systems. Too long they've been ignored. Not talking about monocultures. Nature never works in monocultures. Not talking about the plough, nor industrial inputs. But things like the Haggerty's natural intelligence agriculture, multi-species cover crops, rich diverse grasslands, but most of them holistically grazed and with a large diversity of plant species and now biological inputs. ones that nourish rather than harm. So how do we turn things around, get this mind shift? And I look at my own journey, which was I was ecologically illiterate when I had to take over a farm at the age of 22, even though I'd grown up there. Why was I illiterate? Because this is what gets thrown at us. That's a full-page advertisement in all the major rural weeklies a few years ago for Roundup. That Roundup drum has a sexy smiling face on it. And the language embedded in that ad is trust your killer instincts. The big end of town employs psychologists. They know how to press our buttons. That encourages an ecological literacy, that we can pound it and poison to control it rather than work with it and nurture it. And so that was me. I became a good industrial farmer after the age of 22. And that landscape you can see, which was once a very healthy grassy woodland, I could drive past that and not even recognise that it should have been in hospital in intensive care. That's how illiterate I was. So how do we gain it? Well, I think looking at all the landscape functional, landscape ecologists' work, you can really simplify it down to 5 key functions. Clearly the solar cycle, photosynthesis, putting sugars into the soil, etc., drives everything. So your water cycle, your soil mineral cycle, your biodiversity, dynamic ecosystem communities. And the one that we tend to forget, the number 5 there, that weird species, we humans. If you look at those arrows in that diagram, you'll see that everything's interconnected. You can't damage or enhance one without impacting all the others. But if we go doing those sorts of things, what are we going to do? We're going to cut off all those interactions. So it compounds right across. So that's the sort of challenge we've got as we gain ecological literacy. I became almost scared to walk onto a landscape because I didn't want to start triggering those negative impacts. So I'm going to skip through now with a few examples. So clearly everything comes from, as I mentioned, the solar energy cycle. I actually see my role as a manager to stack on as many solar panels, green plants with chloroplasts, or at least cover anyway, for as long of the year as I can to keep pumping sugars in to drive that whole system. It's a simple way of looking at it, but that pretty much sums up how important that solar energy cycle is. And we can do it through regenerative grazing management, encourage diversity, ground cover, and as much green for as long as you can, 2,000 cows at least in that mob there. Which obviously, that whole thing was developed from watching the large animal herds, savoury in Zimbabwe, constantly driven by predators on the move. So the plants weren't grazed for more than a day or two, then had a long rest. And the same with the buffalo in the North American prairies. Up to 80 million there now, I think, in northern Mexico, America, and southern Canada. So that's the template. And I visited this guy, I'm sad he's just died, Norman Kroon, in the tough Karoo region of South Africa. When he went there in the late 70s, his country he bought was all like that on the Neighbour on the right. It was all desert, had to walk a kilometre to find a perennial. That was 400 years of Dutch and English degradation. Within 3 years, holistic grazing, he had his ground cover up enough that water retention had tripled, and now the productivity on that land, you can see the diversity, softness, etc., is more than threefold to when he started. This is up in the Pilbara, the top end of the Atherton River. The Neighbour on the left of Chila Plains was, you'd probably say, 80-90% bare ground, traditional sheep and cattle grazing since the 1850s. Within only 11 years of doing an RCS course, you can see the transformation on the right, upwards of 100% ground cover. So it can be transformative, and this is another case up in near Bowen in North Queensland. The red arrows in those photos, same marker point in that landscape. So 100 years of overgrazing and burning, rock hard land, you get a big tropical rain, pours off down the river, nutrients into the reef. Within 10 years, totally transformed bottom left. and that erosion gully from the steep side had actively eroding, already healing. There's now eucalypts growing in that gully as well. So I get a bit sick of hearing leading historians and academics saying it's the cloven hoof that's destroyed Australian landscapes. It's bullshit, to use a frame up there. It's their mouths, it's the overgrazing. These are extraordinary machines. They're inoculator machines. They'll re-inoculate with microbes a landscape at the end of a dry. Great fertiliser machines. Their feet are good massagers when well managed, and they're extraordinary mowers. And now we're realising they need to be integrally involved in cropping, sheep or cattle, such as multi-species covers, because there's mutual benefit between the diversity of the cropping species in the animals laying down the cover, fertilising, and all the humates, etc., going in. So the water cycle, this is another good example of when you start to shift what happens. This is in Mexico, northern Mexico, those blue arrows, same point in that landscape. So on the left, a couple of 100 years at least of overgrazing, rock hard land, all the water runs down the bottom. And in only 27 years of shifting to an ecological grazing, you can see the transformation. No water visible, at least 10,000 times more in ground, and the productivity through the roof. And there's plenty of photos like this around the country. On the left, it's after 3 inches in less than 2 hours, no runoff on the left. On the right, probably lost 80% of that rain. This is in the driest continent on Earth, where every drop of rain is precious. And bad management, you can lose most of it. That sort of doesn't add up. When you get it right, and we add just 1% more soil carbon, you can increase water storage per hectare by over 140,000 extra litres of water. Sort of no-brainer stuff. And if we destroy the cover of that soil through cropping or overgrazing, long fallows, you're going to get a form of desertification, because splash erosion, for example, on bare soil actually delivers more compaction than tillage. You can see the violence of that drop there. And this is a schematic of the American prairies. We now know in most of the industrial croplands across the world there's a hard pan just down below the annual cereal root depths, all the diverse roots below and all the life, all died now. And so we've lost all that extra water storage capacity. This is some of Australia's best soils in the Liverpool Plains. I crossed there one morning in 2011 and saw that. Dry season, only 8 mils of rain 12 hours earlier. Hopped over the fence behind that railway line. Those soils were so capped, so dead, no structure, due to so much fertiliser, so much poison, so much tillage. That rain, only 8 mils, should have disappeared in 5 minutes. Here it is there 12 hours later. And this actually, interestingly, is some very early research. It wasn't on overgrazing then, it was a research on prairie grass in the States. The one on the left, the long healthy one, is they didn't cut it with scissors, so it's ungrazed normal prairie ground. Some of those roots go down metres. The one on the right was regularly cropped every 4 or 5 days. So really the two on the right are variants of set stocking overgrazing. And the second from the left is what happens if you holistically graze with short, intense grazing, density and long rest periods. So that knowledge has been around, but sort of repressed in the scientific literature. So cycle number 3, I mean, this is really the big engine, isn't it? Our healthy soils. So we now know, and unfortunately microbes are invisible, so we've never been fully aware of them. I certainly wasn't. We know there's this extraordinary interdependence of communities under the soil. 93% of non-plant organisms are microbes. That's why we're not aware of them. And so they're precious things. And so if you have a classic industrial soil, lots of aggressive tillage or too much fertiliser or spray, you end up with a plant like that on the left. It has none of that precious root. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example. The one on the right more of the regenerative one. That fuzzy stuff is their invisible hyphae that goes off and sources the nutrients and the micronutrients, which is what gets into our healthy food. Now, in a healthy cubic metre of soil, you could have up to 25,000 kilometres of those hyphae working away in that cubic metre. So if you go along and plough, overgraze, overfertilise, you kill all that off and you end up with drug-added crops waiting for their NPK, and the food that comes off it obviously has not got a huge range of nutrients and micronutrients the healthy stuff has. If we don't have cover, and 41 degree air temperature now is not excessive across much of Australia, grazing and cropping. If you go down only nearly half a centimetre, you get a baking impact. You can get temperatures of over 60 degrees. No microbes enjoy that. Then you get these radical sort of bush rangers that seems to come out of Western Australia, the Haggertys who are here today with a world breakthrough approach of replacing industrial inputs with natural inputs and then using sheep, and it can be with cattle, to graze in the system. So that's just one of the shots from a while ago with a nameless Neighbour just after harvest. That's a Neighbour on the left. Sand blowing after harvest going through into the Haggerty's crop, which is what it looks like after harvest and coming into summer. The difference, same water container between the two is quite extraordinary. And that's what the heavily industrial paddock on the left looks like. There's not much life going on around those roots, and certainly no soil aggregation or any of those healthy signs. And that's the Haggerty's paddock, just next door, 40, 50 metres. You can't see the roots because they're covered in glomalin and other wonderful sticky stuff because of the mycorrhizal fungi and other stuff that's there. And so what we're really talking about here is this aggregated arrangement that comes from healthy soils, fed by those sugars, that superglue, glomalin. And you can have at least 50% airspace. If you talk to Walter Yainer, and he's talking later today, he'll say it's a lot more than that. A healthy soil is largely air pockets, sort of a radical thought. And Walter uses this wonderful metaphor that our soils should be like cathedrals. So the cathedral stones are the mineral particles, the cements, the soil organic matter. And you've got more than 50% air, and it's voids and ethereal spaces, like in cathedrals, is where there's a huge amount going on. Water storage, nutrient exchange, protection from disease, etc. In other words, these cathedrals have healthy, intelligent interfaces. And that's just, the red pluses are your cations. That's where the cation exchange occurs. Uptake of essential minerals, trace elements, etc. Just like sticking onto Velcro. But we go, take off the cover, aggressively overgraze or till. It's like that bombed out cathedral in the Second World War. It's not too functional. And it's not too functional because without the fungal-driven healthy soil structures, the plant roots can only indiscriminately suck up soil water solution, just like through straws. So there's no discrimination over toxins and disease agents or nutrients. It contains only a fraction of the good cation trace elements, so it's not much different to hydroponics. In other words, 80% of a soil's biofertility depends on the surface exposure of those cathedral soils. So it's a great metaphor, Walter, wherever you are, thank you. And so following developments like the Haggertys or colonizers, pasture cropping, etc., what's coming out of America interacting with Australians is this multi-species cover cropping, where, just like in nature, you put plants in because they're used to growing in a diverse, variable functioning role. And so Gabe's example, many of you would have heard of him, at least 13 or more diverse functioning plants. It can be to build fertility for the next year's crop, or if you're really clever about it, you can lay, through grazing, some of those multi-species down and still get a harvest of a cereal at the harvest time. Now that shovel, underneath the shovel, that healthy aggregated soil with earthworms, that's Gabe's soil. On top is his traditional neighbour, where Gabe was 12 years previously. You can see the compaction. And that's in only 12 years, and his rainfall penetration is sort of extraordinary. 9 seconds the first inch, 16 seconds the second inch. The industrial neighbour there, the first inch takes 2 hours. I don't know what the second inch took. If you put a penetrometer into that, my guess would be Gabe's soil would be about 1,000 psi. I suspect the neighbours would be, it'd be about 100 psi. That clod of dense soil would be about 1,000 if you didn't break your penetrometer on it. So it's sort of no-brainer stuff when it's moisture that drives our profitability. And his 5 principles of soil health: limited disturbance, treasure that soil, don't stir it up, don't kill that life. 100% soil cover, he calls it armour. Huge diversity of plants and animals, just like nature. Living roots for as long as possible, and integrated animals in the system. So in a nutshell, healthy grasslands and grazed croplands are like liquid carbon pumps. They're pumping that carbon in to drive the whole system in both grazing and cropping. And that's the key to our profitability. And when we generate this high soil organic carbon, we get this remarkable takeoff. You trigger the right methods through grazing and cropping. We now know from the microbiologists it's called quorum sensing. Extraordinary communication between the bugs and the plants, and we haven't got time to go into it. But that's been the big connection with the microbiologists and the soil biologists recently, an explanation of why this remarkable takeoff occurs. But what chance of quorum sensing and tipping points if we graze and crop like that? And so I haven't got time to go into that 4th landscape function, biodiversity, but it's crucial. You get the other 3 lined up. Because of that diversity of plants and grasses, you have your insect controls, your spiders and your parasitic wasps and your birds and your reptiles and the whole thing. And it all adds up as far as both under the ground, the soil, and above ground, pest and disease prevention. And out of thinking vertically for a grazing layer, not just horizontally, we get things like Tagasasti, saltbush, Leukemia in the tropics, etc. Adding tens of thousands of micronutrients, which we'd ignored previously. I certainly had. And so that's enough of skating over the basics. There's some huge implications come out of when we get these landscape functions working. And Paul Hawken was mentioned recently. He got sick of talking to climate scientists and saying, what do we do about it? And a lot of them said, I don't know, we're crunching the numbers on the gases and stuff. So he set about getting 80, 90 scientists and analysts to come up with 100 best methods of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, just focusing on carbon dioxide here. The role of water is huge, as Walter Yono will talk about. When I looked at it, and I'm working with Paul now, his next big study is actually called Regeneration, and Regenerative Ag is going to get the front-running third of the book. I said, look, in your top 20 or so, 6 or 7 of the regenerative methods are there, Regenerative Ag. Let's just call them Regenerative Ag. They're all doing the same thing. We recrunch the numbers, and by nearly 2.5 times, regenerative agriculture is #1 at pulling down that carbon dioxide and squirreling it away, which to me is hugely exciting. And just skating through quickly now, if we get those landscapes working, it opens up this whole thing for reclaiming food systems, urban spaces, culture, self-sufficiency, independence. We can't do this alone. We're going to need this extraordinary symbiosis and synergy with those emerging food cultures around the world. And this is what concerns me as well. The next generation we're going to need to drive all this, they're onto the devices. The top left, children don't get a chance. How long have I got there? Okay, plenty of time. I mean, the stats in Australia are 6-year-olds and under. Only 1 in 4 children have ever climbed a tree or a rock. 9 and 10-year-olds. For every hour of outdoor play, 7 hours in front of one of those devices or screens. How are we going to get that next generation who's going to inherit our problems to get switched back onto nurturing for Mother Earth and her systems? There's lots of good things starting to happen, but to me it's a key issue. And I've got grandchildren, and I try and drag them outside as much as I can. And look, all of these three segments I'm talking about, you could do 2 or 3 day or even courses or even full master's courses on them. And human health, a huge issue. All I can do is just touch on it here. But it's integrally related, as you saw from these graphs, those exponential takeoffs in the modern health diseases, the ADHDs, cancers, autisms, etc. There's a direct correlation with the great acceleration that we've done in destabilising the Earth's systems. So where's the decline of nutrients and micronutrients and phytochemicals in our food come? Yes, we know the big processors, the big end of town, beats the crap out of food so you can store white goods on the shelf for a year or more. As someone who's chaired a company of molecular geneticists, any GM work of complex genomics has huge risks. I mean, it's an arrogance to think that something that's taken millions of years of co-evolution, that we can come along, throw something in and not think there's going to be counterproductive impacts. It worries me immensely, and plenty of examples. The big GM potato company in America the other day just collapsed because of the disease and constant failure that was occurring. Point 3, we know what industrial chemicals and fertilisers are doing, like glyphosate. And if you want to talk to someone on a glyphosate, Zach Bush, doctor in America who has a whole team of researchers. He came out of autism, 20 years of working with autism, and wondered why it was accelerated. Now has PhDs and senior scientists looking at the gut microbiome and what glyphosate is doing in there, and it's incredibly alarming, and that evidence is building. But I would argue most of the decline in nutrients is related to our serious decline in soil health, the fact we don't have carbon in our soils, which is leading to those nutrient-poor foods and micronutrients and phytochemicals, stuff that we're co-evolved for in our African savannas over a long period. Maybe that's where we're going. You would have seen that, I guess. You could almost guess the symbol on the milkshake container. A broad statement, but basically I believe it's pretty right that the worst aspects of industrial agriculture destroys food nutrient availability, diversity and quality, and is putting man-made poisons into our industrial foods. Glyphosate is now showing up in most of the big industrial crops, in breast milk, etc., etc. And we know when it gets into the microbiome, it's having devastating effect. We can't keep ignoring what's now coming at us with more and more scientific research. It's the elephant in the room. We have to start confronting it. And I think if I was Bayer, I'd be wondering who in the hell did my due diligence to buy Monsanto, and I don't think those lawyers have got a job anymore as the court cases now start to come. And I haven't got time to go into it, but there's 3 key reasons why glyphosate's emerging as the worst and most pervasive chemical in our environment. It's a chelator, so that's the chemical that grabs minerals, etc., and clumps them out. So imagine when it's in our guts, if you go and put Roundup on a paddock, you're wondering why it goes yellow, that's what the function is. Its second key role, which is even more alarming, it interferes in what's called the shikimate pathway, which is a protein and amino acid pathway in our guts that forms key proteins, amino acids, hormones, etc. And the third factor of why it's now having alarming effects, it's water soluble, and we know it's penetrating the gut lining, the blood-brain barrier, and even some more delicate mammalian linings like embryonic and placental membranes. So I'll wrap it up there, because there's lots of positives, but we need to be aware of what we do when we walk out into the landscape. I mean, as I said, every day I walk outside the back door, I'm sort of scared of, am I going to do damage or am I going to play a constructive role? And as Gus Beth said, a leading thinker in the environmental area, today's problems can't be solved with today's mind. We've got to change our mindscapes before we can change our landscapes. Or as an old RAM client of mine said to me the other day, the thinking that got us in the shit won't get us out of it. And that's a truism. No one likes change except babies with wet nappies. But we've got to change. We've got to adapt. And we haven't got a lot of time to do it. As Paul Hawkins said, we've really only got one human generation, or a lot of those Anthropocene, destabilised systems could get into runaway event processes. And this year's hinting that it's happening faster than we'd ever thought. One generation. So I'm arguing we need to phase out that 10,000 years of agricultural tradition, that metaphor that we have to interfere rather than nurture and do it gently. It's come from those old metaphors of the plough, poor mechanical and chemical intervention, and poor grazing management, all of which I've done. So our role as landscape managers is to enable those functions to return to health, to self-organise, because that's the big engine that drives all complex adaptive systems right across the natural world, and indeed the human world. The capacity to self-organise using properties within the system that are called emergent properties. We've got to get these things living again by pumping those sugars in as long as we can throughout the year. So I'd argue that regenerative agriculture is an incredibly exciting space to be, because we have many of the profound solutions for the greatest challenge that humanity's ever faced. I mean, the Anthropocene that we're now in makes world wars look like storms in teacups. It is that serious, but because it's not immediate, that's why we're having trouble addressing it. But we have an agriculture that heals natural systems, an agriculture that has key solutions to the Anthropocene crisis. And indeed, we have key solutions to the human health crisis. And I would have said that's a pretty good trifecta. Can we do it? I believe we can. As Charles Darwin said, it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor is it the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that is the most adaptable to change. And so that's what we're confronting, wet nappies or not. I think it's an exciting challenge, and a lot of it's happening here in the West, and I'll leave it there. Thanks, Anthony.